Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Murray. I'm the Food Systems Coordinator with the Sustainability Leadership Center here at PSU. And I'm really happy to be presenting this event today, this Food Choices panel, with the Healthy You Wellness Challenge. Today we're going to hear from some speakers. We have Ben Bowl from Oregon Tilth here, Anna Canning from Equal Exchange, and Jeff Bolin from the Marine Stewardship Council. And the idea behind today's panel is to sort of help you all make more informed food choices. When you think about eating and health, I think a lot of us start by thinking about our own bodies, and the idea behind this partnership with this event between the Sustainability Leadership Center and the Campus Rec Center's Wellness Challenge was to sort of expand that thinking to thinking of wellness at a more environmental and social sustainability level. And so today we're going to hear about some different food labels that certify products and sort of communicate to you as consumers how those products are better for the environment and better for the people that produce them, and often better for your health as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ben, and we're just going to, our format today will be hearing from each of them for a few, maybe 10 to 15 minutes about their organization and their label and their work, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So thank you.
All right, thank you. So I'm Ben Bowl. I work with Oregon Tilth. We are an organization that certifies organic food products, and we also do education and advocacy and outreach, and so we're a nonprofit organization. We're one of about 50 organizations in the U.S. that certifies organic products, and so there's several of them out there. We're one of a bigger one, and we certify organic products in every state in the U.S. and also internationally. So we certify in Latin America, and we can also certify to some of the other organic standards. So Europe has their own standards, so we can certify products in the U.S. that are sold in Europe to those standards. And so we certify farms, which is the most common that you think about, but then there's also the processors that take the raw agricultural products, and then so like Annie's Organics is a company you'll see in a grocery store. They're also certified organic. And then some of the wholesalers, distributors also can be certified organic. And finally, some retailers, restaurants or something that wants to really specialize in organic can also be certified. So I just thought I would start with a little bit about history of organic. And so prior to 1990, there were a lot of different organic certifications out there. And so there were different organizations, different states, all certifying products as organic. And Tilth was one of those. We were a regional organization, sort of a group of regional organizations that were certifying. But there were no uniform standards. So each group or each state could have their own standard and definition of what organic is, and it varied to some degree. And so consumers and producers were really interested in having a uniform standard. And so consumers and producers together asked for this. And so in 1990, there was an act passed that created the National Organic Program and set a national level standard. And so now any product in the U.S. that's labeled as organic has to meet that exact standard. And so there's just one definition. It took 8 years after 1990 to draft the first rule, and so it's an extensive rule. It took a long time, and then the first rule, when it was released in 1998, allowed what was called the Big Three things. And so that was it allowed genetically modified foods. It allowed sewage sludge, which human waste in egg production, and it also allowed irradiation during processing. And so in keeping with the trend of how organic is developed, there were a lot of people upset about this. And so there was some consumer outcry, lots of public comments. And then in 2002, the rule was finalized. And those three things were not allowed anymore, those big three. So organic does not allow genetically modified food in it, does not allow the use of human sewage sludge or irradiation. And so as I mentioned, there's just one standard now. And the public input part continues today. So the organic standard is one that changes over time. We like to think that it is improving over time. And for example, in the beginning, there wasn't a lot of organic seed to be used, but over time, there's been more seed, and so now there'll be stricter requirements on using that organic seed. And so as the industry grows, we like to think that the program improves. And there's what's called the National Organic Standards Board, which meets to take public input, and it also advises how the program is run. And it's made up of farmers and retailers, consumers, environmentalists. And so they meet and they advise the program on their rules and the guidance. And so they met in Portland last year. They move around the country. So just to give you a sense, there was a antibiotic which was used in the production of apples. And they had been allowing this antibiotic in organic production to address something called fire blight. And they decided to not allow it anymore. And there was a lot of controversy around this because organic apple producers in the Northwest didn't have another method to really address this organically, but they decided that they had let it in there for long enough and that it wasn't in keeping with the organic standards, and so they stopped allowing that. And so those are the sorts of decisions that they make that impact the program. So organic, in terms of what does it mean? It's not just the food itself, but it's sort of how it's produced and processed, and it's a farming system that mimics the natural ecosystem. And so I'm the most familiar with the farming side of it as opposed to the processing, so I'll just talk a little bit about that to give you a sense of what organic is. And so the first thing I think people think of is that there's no chemical fertilizers and no chemical pesticides allowed in organic. And so the rule relating to that says that you can't use synthetic products and that you can use non-synthetic products, which are natural things. And there's a few exceptions to that general rule, and there's sort of a national lists of what the exceptions are. So not everything that's allowed is listed out. But so there's just as an example of exception, as I mentioned before, sewage sludge is not allowed. I guess you could call that a natural product, but so it's not a synthetic product, but it's not allowed, and so that's how it varies from that rule. And then also elemental sulfur can be allowed in some production, but it's actually because of the process, the way it's manufactured to bring to farmers, it's actually considered synthetic, and so. But they're still able to use some sulfur on their farm. And so there's a few sort of how it varies. But again, there's no GMOs, no genetically modified organisms in organic. And then also I think it's important to think about the organic farming system. The context of it and the management approach is different than a conventional approach. And so in a conventional approach where producers will apply a chemical for fertilizer or a chemical to address pests. In organic, it's not just a substitution. It's not just you substitute an organic pesticide. For one, these are very expensive if they do exist. But the organic rules are written in a way where you have to do certain things before you can even get to the point of being allowed to use a substitute method. So you have to prevent first, and so that's looking at the health of the crop and the variety of the crop that you're growing so that it's resistant to pests or something like that. And then secondly, you're addressing it with sort of mechanical methods. So you're out there weeding by hand or using a flame torch to weed, or you're doing something like that. And then finally, if all those things aren't successful, you can then look to see if there is some sort of product that is approved in organic that you might use. So it's not just a quick substitution. It's much more of a systems thinking of how to address those common problems of pests and weeds and things on an organic farm. And there's a big focus on the soil fertility. And so this is how producers really address most of those things. So they have to maintain or improve the soil health. They use crop rotations, cover crops. They use compost and manure. And then also there's a regulation I was going to mention related to land. And so the land that organic producers use before they can start harvesting organic products on it, it has to be free of chemicals or prohibited substances for at least 3 years. So there's a lag time. If a producer had been farming conventionally, they can't just the next day switch over and use a different process. There's at least a 3-year period there where they have to transition to ensure that that land is becoming more healthy and can support it. And so weeds are a really hard thing to address, and so farmers do some more innovative things than how they rotate their crops to try to address weeds. So they're not just doing a monoculture of just corn all the time. They're out there trying to think about how they can mix things up, use cover crops, and they don't want to just be out there weeding all the time. And so they try to be really attentive to how they address their weeds. And also in terms of livestock and animals, so the organic standard, of course, covers that. And so the livestock and animals, I think, is interesting because they're not just required to eat organic feed. There's also a lot of living condition elements to the organic standard. And so it's, for instance, they have to have year-round access to the outdoors. The animals have to have access to shade and shelter, exercise areas, direct sunlight, and they can't be totally confined indoors or in yards and feeding pads. So the sort of feedlot system, of continuous feedlot system, is not allowed in organic production. And for ruminant animals like cows, they must have access to pasture for part of the year. So it's 120 days that cows have to be out on pasture, and they have to get a certain amount of their diet from the pasture itself. So organic doesn't require 100% pasture raised, but there is a requirement that these animals are able to go out to pasture for a decent amount of the summertime. So it's sort of is a point about the organic rules, that they're flexible to fit everywhere across the country and across the world. And so that's why perhaps some people would have wanted the animals to be on pasture 100% of the time. In some places around the world, it's just very impractical to have your cows out, and so they set standards that you could certainly do more than that, but there's a bottom level standard that everybody has to meet. And I was just going to mention about the label itself. I have these cards up here that I'm happy to share afterwards. But these are from Oregon Tilth, and it just talks about what the label means when you see it on a food product. And so there's actually sort of 4 instances where you use the label. And so the first is if something is 100% organic. And then and then another one you might see, it just says organic, and that requires 95% organic products. And so you might see that on cereals or something like that. And then there's also a made with organic ingredients, and this is all explained on here, and that's 70% at least. And then finally, for things that have less than 70%, you'll see them listed out in the ingredients part of the label so they won't have the seal on the front of it, but maybe if you flip it over to the back, you'll see that cereal might have organic oats or something like that in it, and they can list them out there. But so the claims that people make, not just the use of the word, which is completely regulated, the term organic, but also the levels of what they can say. There's different variations on it. So I have these here, and it gives little examples and stuff. And then finally, I just wanted to mention a little bit about the process of getting certified. I think it's interesting. So you can, as I mentioned, there were about 50 certifiers in the U.S. So if a farmer wants to be certified, they can pick any of those 50 certifiers that they want to. We're all accredited by the national program. We get checked all the time to make sure we're conforming to the rules. So a producer can pick any one of them. They fill out what's called an organic system plan. And so that is, they list everything that they do on their farm, all their practices, all the substances that they use. And they have to keep records for 5 years at least. And so they're talking about their crop rotations, what they're doing to make sure they're not harming water and soil health and all these things. They, of course, they have to pay a fee. And so for organic certification, For the first year, if you've never been certified before, it's around $600 to $800. The variable part is the inspection, how long it takes, what it's involved there. And then going forward, it's based on the sales, your previous year's gross sales of organic products. And so it's sort of a sliding scale. If processors who have huge sales, that's sort of where certifiers make a little bit more money as compared to a smaller farm. They pay it on a sliding scale. So anyway, after they fill out this plan describing everything that they do on their farm, they submit that to a certifier who reviews it. If they think it's okay, they send out an inspector, and an inspector comes out to the farm. They check and make sure that what they wrote is true, is consistent with what they see on the ground. They make sure that they have buffer zones to protect them from potential chemicals coming from an adjacent farm or somebody spraying their lawn or something like that so it doesn't drift into their crop fields. And then that is reviewed back at the office, and ultimately there's a decision made. And then each year they have to update that plan. They have to let the certifier know if there's been any changes to what they're doing in terms of their production. If they bring in more land, if they're doing a different crop rotation, if they're going to use a different product, they have to let the certifier know. And we inspect every year. We go back out to the property, inspect, and make sure everything is right. And then ongoing, if they make any changes, such as they want to use a different substance that they didn't list out, they have to call and ask the certifier first before they can do that, because they could lose their certification if they use something that isn't fully approved. And so there's an ongoing thing. And then also the ongoing are unannounced inspections, and so we go out in addition to the one inspection a year. We can go out at any time. It could be random, it could be based on a complaint or based on a risk. If we think something might be going on, we can go out. And then we also test around 5% of the farms each year. We take a sample of their products and test them to see if there are any unintended pesticides or something like that on them. We do a residue test. And then I was just going to close. I was just going to mention that the consumer demand for organic production is really continuing to grow quite dramatically. In 2012, U.S. food sales were $28 billion, and that's up 11% just from the year before. And so it's pretty significant growth in the food industry. So, and that's it for me on organic.
So I'm Anna Canning with Equal Exchange, and Equal Exchange is a fair trade company. We do coffee, tea, chocolate, nuts, fruits from all around the world. We work with small farmer cooperatives. We've been around since 1986, and we started out doing coffee, as did fair trade. Fair trade started out as a certification for coffee. It's what I personally know the best, so I'm going to talk a lot about coffee in the course of this. At the end, if there's questions, we might be able to dabble in some other things, but coffee is a great example for how fair trade certification works in general. So we were founded in Boston in 1986. We have a large facility out there. We do a lot of our roasting, et cetera, there. Here in Portland, we've got a smaller collection of worker owners, and we've been here in Portland and in Hood River since the late 90s, I think. So today I'm just going to start off with a little bit of background on the history of fair trade, how we got here, and really to start making sense of some of the fair trade rules. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of how coffee is cultivated. But I thought it was interesting as you were wrapping up your comments there that you can test for residue with organics. You can't do that with fair trade. You can't test for the residue of whether or not something was ethically done. That ultimately what we're talking about is setting a standard for decency in international trade. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as you're talking about and thinking about fair trade, that often what it comes down to is how would you want to be treated? How would you choose to do business with other people? So, here in North America, we all drink coffee. lots of us do, coffee is actually cultivated in a very small part of the world. There's a little belt around the equator between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn around the world where you can grow coffee. And within that space, there's an even more limited area where it will grow successfully. It needs high elevations. It needs non-killing frosts. There's a lot of specific requirements. So there are very limited places where coffee is grown. Because it needs high elevations, it's often grown in very remote areas that you have to go way up the mountainside where most people aren't growing other food crops to find good coffee growing land. And that has meant that historically the people who grow coffee are very isolated, don't have access to a lot of cities and the services that you get there. Approximately 70% of the world's coffee that you see anywhere is grown by small-scale farmers. And that's kind of loosely defined as people who are growing on about 2 hectares of land, which is 5 acres of land. And if you think about that here in the U.S., most people would think that's like barely a hobby farm. And, you often end up with entire families trying to make their living off of that tiny bit of land. And then when it comes to the next generation, I don't even know how you do that one when you split the farm up. So that's kind of a context for some of the conditions of coffee farming historically. When you're talking about one of these farm families, an average farm family is going to produce, this is averages that we take from all the producers that we buy from. It varies a lot regionally, et cetera, but your average farm family is going to produce somewhere around 22,400 pounds of green coffee per year. And that's not counting things that wasn't export grade, that they sold elsewhere, whatever. That's 2,400 pounds of coffee. When we bring coffee into the U.S., we have to move it in 53-foot shipping containers. So like the thing you see hanging off the back of a semi on the freeway, that gets filled up with coffee bags, and that's how it's brought into the country. That's 38,000 pounds of coffee approximately. So what that means is that each little farmer and their crop fills up something like 6% of a shipping container. So if you're one farmer, you do not stand a chance of selling your coffee to somebody and moving it out of the country where the money is. It'd sort of be like if you bought a cow and walked up to New Seasons and you're like, hey, I'm going to supply you with milk. It doesn't work that way, that you wouldn't have the means to pasteurize it, you wouldn't have the means to cool it, bottle it, all that stuff. And that long, story through the supply chain is a lot of what is important to us when we're working with farmer cooperatives, is that question of volume and how you get there. Historically, a lot of that has been achieved by a variety of middlemen and traders. In Central America, they call them coyotes, which kind of implies that they are preying on the weak, that they're not, straightforward, honest business people. So, historically, coffee farmers have lived in these very remote areas, and someone will come around to the gate and say, I'll give you, $10 for that bag of coffee. And your choices are sell it or not sell it. You don't have any idea how much the coffee is actually worth. You don't know if someone's going to come along tomorrow and offer you $12. And the thing that you know is that you do need money. And so a lot of times, historically, farmers have sold really good coffee for far less than it's worth because they didn't know and they didn't have other options. So that, those are some of the conditions that fair trade got started to address. Fair trade certification started in the U.S. sometime in the mid-90s, around 1996, I think. And one of the things that really forced that issue to the table was, so coffee is traded on the New York Stock Exchange, just like you hear lots of other numbers going up and down every day, when they wrap up the markets. Coffee prices also go up and down. Right now they're like $1.90 something. They're up some. They've been down some. I think last week it was $1.30. They go up and down constantly. If you've ever followed any other wheat futures, pork bellies, I don't know, all the other things that they trade on a commodity exchange, coffee is like that as well. It's very volatile. And in the mid-90s to early 2000s, the market was incredibly low, that a pound of coffee was trading for 40 cents a pound in New York, which is, even in their dollars was ridiculously low and well below the cost of production. And when you're talking about, another thing that I think is really important is, I've explained this to people before and they're like, well, if you can't make money at it, get out. And part of the challenge is if you've already invested land or effort and money into your land, then you have to keep taking care of that year after year, because you never know, next year might be a better year. And it's also what your family has done historically. So those are some of the conditions that fair trade originated to help make sense of. And as we start to talk about the certification, I would say that fair trade currently is in a state that is in many ways sort of analogous to what you were talking about with organics, prior to the National Organic Program, that there is not a single thing that is defined as this is what fair trade is. That there are, a couple different overall programs, but there's not a single national consensus, let alone international consensus on what that is. But some of the general standards coming from the origins of that price crisis in the 90s is a fair trade minimum price per pound of coffee. Then on top of that, there's also a premium agreed on for organic coffee. So if a farmer has gone through all the work of getting their coffee certified organic, under fair trade's law or rules, they get an extra 20 cents per pound, and that's to reflect the extra work that goes into organic production. There's another 5 cents a pound set aside as a social premium. Is it 5 cents or 50? They change regularly, and different rules have slightly different numbers. It's between 5 and 15 cents a pound as a social premium, and then the farmer cooperative organizations set that aside, and that's used for their development funds. And I'll get back to that in a minute, because that's a really key part of what fair trade is about. One of the other, basic standards of fair trade is transparency, that it has to be clear how much you're going to get paid for your coffee. That sounds really ridiculous. Like, if you're selling something, someone should tell you how much they're buying it for. It's a very basic thing, but it shows you how broken the system of international trade can be. So it's important to have, pricing information available, to write contracts that spell out who pays for each aspect of it. And then within the farmer cooperatives, that information needs to be made available. Another really important part of fair trade, according to us at Equal Exchange, and there's a lot of controversy about this right now, so we'll get to that in a minute. Fair trade in coffee used to deal exclusively with farmer cooperatives. And what that meant is, small-scale farmers in different regions banding together to figure out how to fill that shipping container and how to process that coffee. So instead of one guy with 2,000 pounds of coffee, you have 200 guys, or, some cooperatives organize because of a variety of local laws and constraints. Maybe they'll have 10 cooperatives of 200 farmers, and they'll make one big super cooperative. often called a second-level cooperative, and then that is the organization that, as an international buyer, we deal with because they're the ones that hold the export licenses. So there's some of this organizational stuff that gets complicated because of the rules of international business, but one of the functions that cooperatives play is simply those economies of scale. They also do a lot of local development work that we expect that we walk outside and there are roads, that there'll be clean water when we turn on the faucet, that there'll be schools somewhere if we get sick, that there's a doctor to go to. And that's not the case in a lot of, tiny remote areas. So over time, a lot of the cooperatives that we work with have used their fair trade premium money to invest in their communities. And that's, they'll build clinics, they'll build schools, they'll invest in better processing equipment, they'll invest in quality equipment so they can understand and improve their own processing and cultivation of coffee, which then yields better quality and, down the line, better prices. So, in my opinion, in our opinion as Equal Exchange, those cooperatives are at the heart of what makes fair trade work, that it's not simply about a fair wage, because that's actually not entirely addressed in a fair trade standard, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that it is about creating a system of trade and not aid around the world. So I keep on kind of alluding to controversy, et cetera. Within the way that fair trade standards are established is there's a international NGO called the Fair Trade Labeling Organization, made up of representatives from different countries where the term fair trade is used, with representation from business, from producers, from academics, and they have agreed on international standards for what that means. And having that international element has been incredibly important because fair trade is about doing business across, transnational business. So then the business of actually applying labels to the products that go on your shelves has been delegated out to what they call licensing initiatives in each country. So in Canada, it was Transfair Canada. In the U.S., it was an organization called Transfer USA that changed its name to Fair Trade USA. And there was pretty much just one per country. And then that changed a couple years ago in 2012 when the licensing initiative for the United States decided that they were actually going to pull out from that international agreement and going to go their own way on making standards. And there was, a lot of upset in the world of fair trade, particularly among concerned companies that had been doing it for a long time. One of the first changes that Transfair USA made, or Fair Trade USA made when they pulled out, was to allow plantations to become part of fair trade, that you could have fair trade certified plantations. They would have to meet, certain hourly wage rules, et cetera. There was a lot of uproar in the fair trade community because of that, because we had been building what we conceived of as a movement to empower small-scale producers around the world, and bringing plantations in under the same seal, indistinguishable to consumers everywhere, seemed like it was, A, confusing things, and B, when we talk to our producer partners, they don't feel like there was a shortage of supply of fair trade coffee already on the market. That out of someone did a study, and basically about 20% of coffee produced under fair trade conditions by fair trade certified cooperatives, about 20% of that coffee gets sold actually on fair trade contracts. The rest of it doesn't have buyers and goes, through other channels, gets publicly traded, sold for whatever they can get for it. So it's not like there was a shortage of supply. Another of the concerns that has been raised, and there's been recently actually some press coverage around this, that workers on plantations, even fair trade certified plantations, those workers and their communities don't receive the same benefits on those plantations as once they're small scale farmers working and selling their products to a cooperative. That there was recently a news story about corruption and labor exploitation on fair trade plantations in tea in India, I think it was. And there's concern that allowing plantations into fair trade and setting up separate rules for fair trade certified plantations will undermine in-country labor organizing by kind of embedding some of those labor laws in the terms of transnational business as opposed to local government regulations. So, making those terms only perhaps apply to a smaller portion of the population. And ultimately, a lot of people around the world were pretty upset that a top-down solution was kind of thrust onto a movement that had been built to support the historically oppressed. So that's some of the controversy that's going on at Equal Exchange. We're currently certified by another certifying body that has come along called. Their certification is called Fair for Life. It's a old certification or certifier that has long done organic certification, and they're inspecting to a lot of those same international standards. And I think the important thing out of all this, I could start talking about nerdy certification stuff and everybody can glaze over, but I think that the important thing about all of this is that it is challenging to try to write rules about what is and isn't ethical. It's very challenging to enforce those. And, as consumers, I think it's important to understand where your food comes from. And there's not really a shorthand for that. We try to have things meet minimum standards, but sometimes it's about continuing to be a person when you go to the grocery store and not just being a consumer looking for the lowest price tag. So that's kind of my conclusion. I think I'd be happy to talk more about any number of things when we get to questions, but I'll pass it to you.
It looked like an Academy Award when I walked in. My name's Jeff Boland. I'm the commercial director for the Marine Stewardship Council. I live up in Seattle and originally from Boston, so getting used to this rain. But I like the sight of mountains outside my house. Before I kind of dig into things, you've heard about essentially farmers, right? Organic and farming for the most part, and obviously processing involved in that. Farming, I mean, coffee is farming. Fish, right? Not fish farming, by the way. We don't operate in the way of aquaculture. We can talk about aquaculture, but wild fish. So I'll start with a couple things, which is. Anybody in here consume organic food or buy organic food? Anybody not, I should post it. Someone raise their hand and say, I don't. I'm the bad guy. Right. Okay. Coffee or tea or something fair trade? Fair trade? Bad guy? How many people in here cook fish? Cook fish. How many people in here don't really cook fish? Okay. Yeah, those numbers were different to start with. How many people in here cook a wide variety of fish? Smaller, right? What's a wide variety mean? How many different kinds of, not recipes, but kinds of fish do you cook? Yeah, that's pretty big. That's pretty big, and we're out in the Northwest, and it's accessible. So we're talking about fish here, and an interesting place to start with is and you hear this in the seafood industry, which is people will say, anybody go and have a bad burger at a bar, or a pub or something. It wasn't good. Maybe it didn't make you sick, but it just wasn't that good, right? Probably go back to that pub anyways. And you're certainly going to have another burger. You just are, right? I mean, just if you do, you are. Anybody ever eat a piece of fish that either you didn't like or made you sick? How long was the bounce back on that one? Right. I'm never drinking gin again. Got back to the gin before you got back to the fish. So seafood, in the context of this country, of the U.S. and Canada, is an interesting concept, right? For most people, Middle America, seafood is canned tuna, crappy canned tuna, skipjack, the basic with blown off bones, not even the good stuff. Catfish, which, I mean, if I'm in North Carolina, New Orleans one night, and, catfish is what you do, it's fine, but, it's most of it's farmed anyways these days, and it's not really catfish, it's basa from Southeast Asia. And there's nothing against farmed fish, by the way, it's just not our domain, but it's the notion of fish in this country. In the U.S., we eat, on average, under 15 pounds of fish per year per person. It's just incredible. And I'll throw a few more questions and then dig in a little bit to the background, but now I'm talking about seafood. Anybody have an idea which is the lowest carbon footprint protein, animal protein? Right. Now, I didn't create that, but it's true. It's the lowest, basically it's the most environmentally friendly. You can look at it from that perspective. Anybody wonder which is probably just purely the healthiest animal protein? Right. It's kind of funny, seafood is the world's largest, most widely traded global food commodity. Bet no one knew that either. We eat 15 pounds or so per year on average. I eat more. You obviously eat more than that because you cook a lot of that. In Japan, it's like 90 pounds per person. Now, that's a lot, right? That is a lot. I used to live in Spain. It's not as high as Japan, but it's really, really high. But it's still seafood, right? I mean, and you think about a supermarket and what, the meat and chicken section, and the fruit and vegetable section, and the Folgers area. I'm not going to say coffee, the Folgers area. Right? It's not really coffee. But then there's fish. And so let me tell you about MSC and what we do. And as I said, I'm the commercial director. The regional office is based in Seattle. That covers the Americas, so North, South America, North, South, Central America, and technically the Russian Far East, for reasons that I can explain if you're interested. The headquarters is in London. We're a global organization. Unlike what you've heard here, we're the standard. MSC maintains the global standard when it comes to wild capture fishery certification. So we're this, I could paint the picture of how everybody fits in, but in effect, we're the global standard. It's not governmental. We're nonprofit, and it's a voluntary program. We work with, basically, it's a multi-stakeholder entity. So we're nonprofit. We work with, there are certifiers that carry out the work against our standards. There are two, and I'll talk about them. So a certifier. There are companies that are basically the ones that channel the demand, process the product, sell the product, right? In our world, an equal exchange is akin to a Pacific Seafood or a Highline or whatnot, or even a McDonald's in some respects. Companies that take product and sell it to consumers. But that's not what we are. We're considered the global standard, but it isn't by anybody's government. It's just more of it was a mission in and of itself. I came to this, I've worked a certain amount in nonprofits and doing similar work. I've also worked in the private sector, so I kind of have a varied approach and a varied perspective on all of this. I know the CEOs both of Fair Trade USA, Paul Rice, and Hans Thayer, who's Fair Trade America, right? Both good people, very different perspectives. So I would urge you, if you find this debate curious, read about it. It's really, neither of them are bad people. And it's really interesting, and it's a sort of a debate on what's the proper direction and how do you have greatest impact. And I'm not going to tell you my views, but you can go and read on it. I would urge you to do that. And the organics have great debates, right? I remember when Michael Pollan wrote an article a number of years back in the New York Times Magazine talking about, well, organic is wonderful, and all of a sudden it was, the industrial organic, and that sort of threw things in the face of, the original ideas. So. In the way of seafood, MSC was created, like other nonprofits, as a response to a problem, providing a global solution. In the 90s, a number of fisheries everybody understand what a fishery is? Because I didn't for a long time. Right, good. It took me a long time. A fishery is kind of a cross section of things. It's a geographic area in a body of water with a species or multiple species that are targeted for capture. A fishing method, a gear type, if you will. And so, Pacific salmon could be one. Pacific salmon with purse seining, tuna with purse seining, lobster trap. There's a whole range of fisheries worldwide, and they're kind of governed and managed through these multinational fishery management councils. It's not the easiest thing, but think of it as an entity in and of itself. And there are harvesters. We don't say fishermen so much. Harvesters that are out there catching it using certain methods, following regulations in theory, and then bringing product back. And so MSC was created as a response to a problem. In the late 90s, a number of fisheries, particularly in the Newfoundland, kind of the northeast Atlantic Canada, were collapsing. They were collapsing because back in the days long before any of us, people would go out, fish, bring back, right? And then industrialization, more and more capture, industrial capturing, large volumes, no one really paying attention to how many cookies are left in the jar, and you have fisheries collapsing because when you're between what's happening in the climate and more importantly what's happening in if there's 100 out there and you're taking too many and they can't reproduce, math is quite simple. And so a number of fisheries started to collapse. And at the time, World Wildlife Fund, WWF, you all know that it's a global federation, funky organization in and of itself, the panda, saw that as an environmental disaster, not surprisingly, and certainly was. They got together with the Unilever Corporation. Unilever, anybody know what they do? Name a product, just curious. Soap. Right, soap. Lever, right? Lever, Unilever, Dial, things like that. Well, at the time, they were the world's largest whitefish buyer. I think it was Mrs. Paul's or it was Bird's Eye Igloo. Yeah, whitefish, Bird's Eye Igloo. They subsequently sold that, and then subsequently are back in the seafood game. Is smaller, but at the time they were the world's largest whitefish buyer. So they got together, those two organizations, because WWF saw it as an environmental disaster. No surprise there. And Unilever, thinking wisely, saw it as a real risk to their business, because if you have a problem with supply, how are you going to hit the revenue model? Right? So they got together and started pursuing a solution, and that kind of went through a process, bringing lots of folks into discussion. And the notion was to create a market-oriented solution because, of course, Unilever being in the market. And they said, well, with a market-oriented solution, maybe something can work. And so what they did was, the outcome of that was the creation of really one major standard and one supporting standard. So the first one is the MSC Fishery Standard. And it's an environmental standard that basically assesses against the highest criteria. And we don't need to go into that criteria, but it's long, lengthy, and technical. The highest criteria, how well a fishery is managed. In other words, can a fishery be considered sustainable or sustainable to the MSC standard? A second standard, which again it's not environmental or technical, it's basically a traceability, we call it chain of custody standard, to ensure that product that travels from a fishery that was called sustainable, or MSC certified sustainable, that the product can travel through a supply chain and get to consumers and still be called sustainable. In other words, that fish came from that fishery, right? There's an inherent link. And then to work with the market, so you work with fisheries on achieving the standard and wanting to get there. You work with the market on creating market demand for those products. Companies put in place sourcing policies saying we're only going to source X, or we're going to endeavor to source X by a certain date, thereby creating demand through the system. Fisheries are going to do what they need to do, and fishermen and harvesters. Companies say we're going to only buy certified product. Fisheries is going to respond and saying we better get our act together and we got to get certified because we want to be able to sell to these companies. And so it was a market-oriented solution that, again, we're talking about late 90s, became MSC. At day zero, there were two standards and no fish certified, right? And ultimately, like any other system, you get early adopters jumping on board. But in the earliest of days, Western Australian rock lobster and cockles, Bury Inlet in the UK, I think, Bury Inlet cockles got certified. Which, right? Anybody have cockles? I had them once. And Western Australian rock lobster is not it's not really center of the plate, at least for these markets. But with time and commitments, you started to see a change. And there's kind of steps of what happened But we've gone from 0 to today. There's almost 300 fisheries that are certified, and many others that are in the process of getting certified. There are companies, most of the leading retailers and food companies worldwide have commitments, basically seafood commitments, based around the Marine Stewardship Council. Walmart in 2006 declared that by 2011, they didn't make it, by 2011, 100% of their wild fish would be MSC certified. They didn't make it, but it was a bold commitment, and they deserve a pat on the back for doing it. They had no idea what they were saying, but they said, we got to be aspirational. No, I mean, and I spend too much time down in Bentonville. It's not good place. It's really weird. But sometimes people have to be aspirational to change the world, and they did. But so you have companies like Walmart, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Whole Foods, Kroger, Super Value, McDonald's, Costco, and I could name a long list of global companies. In fact, the MSC's strongest presence is not in North America in terms of adoption. It's really Central and Northern Europe, and Germany, and Denmark, and the Netherlands, Benelux countries, the UK, but growing. So MSC has gone from an idea in a seed in the 90s to something that's, as I said, over 10% of the global catch is certified or in the process of getting certified. The largest companies, the largest buyers, certainly on the retail side of things, that have very specific commitments, whether they've achieved them or not, very specific commitments to sourcing, which creates that demand and creates action at the fishery level. There are over 25,000 products that carry the MSC Eco label. Again, they're all fish. Well, I shouldn't say that. They're fish, fresh and frozen. They're canned. They're fish oil supplements. You see more and more, particularly in the U.S. Some pet food. And so those carry the MSC Eco label, and menus more and more. McDonald's announced, was it 1 year ago? I think it was roughly January last year, work finally got them to do it, to announce that every one of their fillet of fish in the U.S., and this is also the case in Europe, is MSC certified, because it comes from MSC certified fisheries. They've gone through the traceability program, and the packages carry the label. I've never eaten a fillet of fish from McDonald's. Just never was my fast food of choice. But stuff like that changes the world, whether y'all think highly of McDonald's or I think highly of McDonald's or not. It puts a lot of pressure, positive pressure, on fisheries to get themselves into the program. The other thing it does, because this is kind of in the theory of change, and I'm sure these guys have talked a lot about theory of change at work. In our theory of change, it is that leverage, right? So in the U.S., does anybody eat a fillet of fish from McDonald's? Anybody ever have one? Good. All right. No, there should no. The fish in there, do you know what it is? No, of course you don't. It's white. At least it ends up white. No, it is. It's Alaskan pollock. It's a fascinating story. There's a video that they put out. These are the fish that's got in factory processors, so boats that are out there catching the fish and processing it on board into fish sticks, into surimi, which is the fake crab for sushi, the imitation crab, on board, literally floating factories. It's amazing stuff. It's a massive fishery, 1.2 million tons a year. 1.2. Thinking of your container thing, where was that? Was that 18 tons? What was 38. It? Yeah, 38,000. 1.2 million tons out of Alaskan pollock a year. So that's what goes into the McDonald's fillet fish in the U.S. and it's different depending on the countries. But the pollock fishery, it's a great example, and it's a great example within MSC. The companies put in sourcing policies say we're gonna source only MSC certified product, and so the Alaskan said, well, great, tally ho, and the Russian pollock fishery said, they're like, and so the price there was a $200 per ton, if I'm not mistaken, premium that the Alaskans are getting over the Russians. And so what do the Russians do? What would you all do? Get your house in order. And so what they do, they started getting their house in order and working towards getting it certified. They're certified today, which, by the way, the Alaskans are not very happy about. But again, there's a dynamic. They've got premium for a lot of years. And so it affected change on the waters. And that's the notion within MSC. So there's a fishery standard. It is not easy to achieve. It's like it's at least a year-long process. Fisheries go. This is technical. This is stock status, biomass counts, environmental impact, scientists, technical stuff. a fishery, the fishery standard is based on 3 principles: evaluation of stock status, so how's the biomass doing? What kind of impact is there on the ecosystem? Is it well managed? And the process to get there is long and rigorous. And most fisheries in the world are not going to achieve it and haven't. And so they work down a path, fishery improvement path. Fishery can ultimately get certified. Chain of custody applies to processing companies, people in the supply chain. It's traceability. It's not technical. It's not science. This is logical for most good companies that can demonstrate this. And then we have a labeling program, obviously, which is for the notion of connecting consumers within the entire system. A consumer can go to a store and say, that's MSC certified, I'm going to buy it because. So that's the world within that we live within. We are the nexus or the whipping post, whatever you want to call it, for everyone. For companies, for NGOs, we get hammered by everyone at some point in time, which people will say if no one likes you, then that's a good thing. But I don't, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But we are a process through which we convene, we discuss, we debate, and things get pushed and pulled. And so it's apropos to everything that was just said here. I mean, organic, while it's a government standard, it's still something that people are trying to achieve and get that awareness among consumers, and it's much higher. I mean, people are buying organics at a much higher level. Fair trade, not really an environmental standard, has environmental components, but a social standard. Ours is not a social standard. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be one, and doesn't mean there aren't people working down that path. But it's not. And the notions of awareness and consumer adoption, all of you are incredibly aware, and we'll all go out and buy MSC certified fish and equal exchange and other fair trade products and organics only. We all know that. But the goal is not really any of us, right? The goal is Ohio and Kansas and middle market America to be thinking, well, my cousins in New England are fishermen, or out in the Pacific Northwest are fishermen or organic farmers. I'm going to do something to support them because it's, by the way, it's livelihoods and it's for our future. So, I could talk for hours on MSC or any of these topics, but I'll leave it there and just say it's, the goal I think here is for you all to think about reading labels and think about, I'm not just going to, maybe I won't buy the cheapest thing, which, by the way, in 6 months or a year might not be as expensive because more people are buying it, right? People do rely on our money. And so the notion of, do we get a babysitter or not? Well, that baby, or do I pay the babysitter an extra $2? That babysitter probably needs those $2 more than I do, and that creates more flow in the economy, and it creates a better system of buying and selling. And so all of these things are really intrinsically linked. I'm going to stop. I think I'm going to stop and just say thanks. If there are any questions at MSC or whatever, throw them on out.
Wow, I wish we had more time. Thank you all so much. We are at our hour mark, but I'm happy to stay for a few questions if you guys are okay with answering a few, if there are any questions. And I'm going to pass the mic for the questions because they're recording them. So.
I actually have 2 questions. I'm hoping one is quick about organic. So is everything that Oregon Tilth certifies already certified USDA organic? Is it like an extra certification, or are you just doing it on behalf of USDA?
Right, we do it on behalf of the USDA, and so they can use our label and the USDA organic label once we certify them to the organic standard. So they can put a little Oregon Tilth thing on there if they want to, but then that also allows them to use the USDA certification. The USDA itself does not certify anyone. We are accredited by the USDA to certify to their standards.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I have a question about fish. Maybe your question, Jenny, but it seems like there might be a tension between, or I'd like to hear a little bit more to understand how, the more Walmart, McDonald's, all these people are latching onto this great thing, doesn't that in itself deplete the fishery? Like do at some point the fisheries have to say, yeah, we're certified, but we can't sell to you anymore because there aren't enough fish?
Yeah, it's a great question. In this country, it'll never happen because no one consumes enough fish in reality. And I mean, the question's fine, but there's a reality to it. But again, it's a global commodity, so it's the better way to ask the question. It's not really about Walmart per se, but about just people putting sourcing policies. Let me answer it a couple ways. One is, regardless of someone's commitment to buy, that has nothing to do with the fishery being able to stay certified or not, right? And so the fisheries Portuguese sardine fishery. We don't eat. Once upon a time in this country, people had a lot of sardines. Super healthy. You could probably dunk.
Yeah, but you don't want to have to sit next to it.
It smells like a sardine, right? But he can dunk with both hands. So we don't eat a lot of sardines in this country, but in a lot of, certainly in Europe, right? In Spain and southern Europe, a lot of sardines consumed. The Portuguese sardine fishery was certified. Stock status, I don't know why, but basically the biomass stock's dropping significantly. I don't know why. Environmental overfishing, fishery got suspended, lost its certification in effect because it failed to continue to meet the criteria. Whether Walmart or McDonald's or anybody else had a commitment, that stuff happens, right? So they're unrelated. Now, in terms of people having these commitments to buying and sourcing, there is an important angle, and this goes both to the big picture of is there enough fish, and also kind of just the concept of diversification. People in here probably eat some salmon. There's a lot of, for those I asked who eats what or how many things do you cook, for most of us, especially in the Northwest, you probably eat some salmon, you probably eat some Pacific cod, and maybe some halibut when you can afford it, and whatever. Limited range of things, and you eat some factory-produced shrimp. But there's a lot of fish from a lot of different areas, and so there's also an important need, if you will, for diversification. So the answer is a little bit nuanced. These commitments ultimately could force companies to rationalize their own ability to sell, right? Because if Walmart wants to sell salmon, and it gets to a point where let's say they wanted more, or company X wanted more than they could actually get, because getting would mean that it would cross over the line, those companies end up being forced to do something. Right? They can't really back off the commitments of it. They're going to be forced to make decisions. And a lot of times those decisions are like any other product development category, which is introduce something new, try something. There's no magic to salmon. There's no magic to cod. Right? I grew up in New England. I ate Atlantic cod, which, by the way, is, at least the New England cod stocks are a disaster. I grew up eating haddock. Anybody in here ever eaten haddock? Right. Probably not out here, though. You probably had it when you're east. Great stuff. If you're from New England, out here, you're like, just boring whitefish. People on the East Coast don't really eat halibut. You don't eat swordfish out here a whole lot. There's a lot of fish that's out there, so diversification is important. The last point, which is also worth mentioning, is wild fish stocks are not growing. And if they're growing, they're not growing quickly. They're stabilizing, getting better, sustainable, but you're not going to see any hockey stick. Aquaculture, however, is growing significantly. So it's now past the point that global consumption on the way of fish is aquaculture is past more 50%. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's done the right way. This is protein. This is people eating in protein. And I and MSC have nothing against aquaculture. It's not within our scope. There are other organizations that do certification work in that area. It's certainly growing faster. You can make the argument that in some respect, at the protein, food consumption, food safety level, it's really important. At the environmental level, different issues, more akin to organic, because it's inputs and outputs. It's not impact on the ecosystem.
So it's more about McDonald's saying we'll use different types of fish for our sandwich. Like the certification isn't about a certain type; it's just about saying we'll go to MSC.
Exactly.
Certified something.
Exactly. They use cod and hoki in different parts of the world, and I think hake, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure hake actually. So different parts of the world, different options. Again, I think there's a diversification versus overconsumption. If we got to that issue of overconsumption, then it's important. Watch out for unintended consequences, but certainly in this region, North America, we're not anywhere near that.
So I just heard a TED Talk this weekend, and I can't think of her last name, but Myra from Earthbound Farm gave the talk, and she did a great job of talking about large-scale organic. And let's see if I can formulate my question. I think there's this idea out there that says it's not the same, and there's a problem. And I guess from the standards perspective and the actual practices, what's your perception of that?
Yeah, so regardless of scale, all producers have to meet the same standards. And I think local is a great thing. And, I purchase They're not mutually exclusive, right? So I purchase locally and organically at the PSU Farmers Market on Saturday. There's a bunch of certified organic producers down there, and I like purchasing locally for a variety of reasons. But in terms of a third-party certification that sets standards for sort of practices that are environmentally friendly and are better than conventional system, I think organic sets that standard, and all producers are held to the same standard. And I know that big farms can still be organic and meet that standard. And I think, you know, local is great, and I like to purchase local, but not everybody can purchase local organic products. And so I think it's still okay to buy organic stuff at the grocery store, and it's been grown in California because they still meet the organic standard.
Great.
I want to add to Beverly sort of as the notion of local. We hear it all the time. We met, we were with companies trying to get them to, basically buy in or, sort of sign up for the concept. Brown University, I'm giving you a couple specific examples. Brown University in Rhode Island and Google, and I'm sure there's others, but both of them said, oh, it's interesting what you do, but we source locally, so we're good. There's so many answers to that when it comes to the world of seafood. It's a little bit of elitist, right? Okay, so we sit on the coast near Rhode Island or in California, we can do that. Well, you can. What happens when I used to live in Chicago. It smelts, right? You get smelts like for a week of the year out of the lake. That's about all you can get locally, or invasive Asian carp, right? So that, not really an option. B, just because it's local in our world, probably in anybody, doesn't mean anything environmentally. Sorry, it might mean a lower carbon footprint getting product to you, but it doesn't mean that person didn't pluck the last fish out, in our case. So it's, and 3, I think local is hotter than any of this right now. And I buy into it, right? I mean, I agree as well. I want to support you. You're my next door neighbor. Or I know that if I support you, then that money will come around and have more investment in the community, things like that. But, they don't mean the same thing. And it's a real important distinction. And in some respects, coffee's a funny one, because if I was sitting with folks recently having a coffee, and we were in Whole Foods, and it had the chalkboard at the coffee stand, and it was like the number of tick boxes was locally this and organic this. I mean, it was bang bang. It was like 9 things, right? And you feel like, with all due respect, since you guys live here, Portlandia, right? I mean, I'm rubbing my tummy and patting my head, and got all these things ticked off, and it's very, very, it's incredibly difficult. And coffee's like the poster child for that. Wild fish can't be organic. There's no input. Farm fish could be organic. So you really have all those distinctions going on, and lots of it's personal choices, and lots of it we do a lousy job on because there's so many tick boxes. But it's important just to be able to distinguish between what's what.
That's great. Well, now hopefully when you all are shopping and see all those tick boxes, you know what a few of them mean a little bit more. Can we give a round of applause as a team? Thanks so much, you guys, and thank you all for coming.
If anybody wants to learn a bit more, there are fun comic books, because we know certification is fun. We put it into a comic book form.
I'll take it with my kids.
And I have less fun little cards.